Welcome in the beat writer for the Sacramento Kings, and of course, the host of Candlestick Chronicles, our guy, Chris Biderman. Chris, there's a lot we wanted to discuss. Obviously, my man is decked out in his gear. He's ready to talk about who returned to practice, and we'll get to the 49ers and the Raiders coming up here in just a few minutes. But let's start with last night's Kings win. I wasn't there. Can you tell me about the vibe in the arena when that clock finally hit zero?
Man, I'll be honest, like early in the game, it was looking pretty ugly, right? Like it was the I forget what the run was that Denver started the game, but I think Denver made 8 of their first 9 shots. The Kings started, I don't know, 1 of 6 or something like that. And it was just really quiet. And particularly coming off the way the Tuesday game went the night before, people were pretty nonplussed. And there wasn't a whole lot of defense played in that first half. Obviously, the Nuggets scored 75 points. But then you could just tell, clearly the message in the locker room at halftime was about improving the defensive pressure. And that started with Davion Mitchell and KZ Okpala and just, making the Nuggets feel them a little bit more defensively, which is what Mike Brown talks a lot about. And then in the fourth quarter, it started, the crowd really started to get into it as the Kings climbed their way back into that game. And, I've been covering the Kings for only a couple years now. So, I know what people say about the Kings fan base, but that really last night was the first I've ever experienced it at that level where like Golden One Center was legitimately shaking. Like it was, you could feel the building kind of pulsing when De'Aaron Fox hit that elbow jumper, and Trey Lyles made that tip to Domantas Sabonis that he dunked it in. Like it felt like far more meaningful than a December game. And I think it speaks to the way, the Kings homestand had been going, the fact that, they're 1-3 coming in with disappointing losses to Charlotte and Washington. To get that win over a team that's been the top seed in the West really meant a lot. Not only to the team, obviously, to kind of turn things around, but to the fans. And you can just feel it in the atmosphere of the building. And it was pretty cool to see, honestly, because, talking to some guys who have played elsewhere, that type of home atmosphere is not common around the league, right? Like there are not a whole lot of places in the NBA where a building pulsates for, during a win in December. So I think it was a big win for the Kings, not only from a standing standpoint, because we know how crowded the Western Conference is, but just for the vibes. Like the vibes have been pretty bad, to be honest. And I think, to have a win like that, that's sort of a product of increasing defensive pressure in particular, was really big for them. And I think hopefully for their sake, it can be a tone setter going forward, because they can't be dropping games like they did to Charlotte and Washington if they're going to, stay out of the play-in and maybe be a top 6 team in the West.
We talked a little bit, a lot actually, about how the game on Friday against the Wizards, that Golden One Center crowd seemed to be trying to will them back into the game with every bucket that got it from 22 to 19. They're trying to rise up and do things, and it just wasn't able to happen. It kind of felt like they pushed the Kings to the finish line last night with the energy that they brought, the energy they provided. And the Kings fed off that. And I'd say most importantly on the defensive end, they got some real clutch stops towards the end of that fourth quarter. Davion with the steal, Trey Lyles stealing it, getting to Sabonis, things of that nature. Kevin Huerter got a steal. It really felt like the Kings players were feeding off the energy of that Golden One Center crowd last night.
Yeah, and you can tell that the crowd reacts differently to a defensive stop, right? Like if they get a steal or a block shot, like there are moments where it feels louder than like a bucket in many cases.
Yeah, it's new. It's not something we've seen too many times.
Right. And so they definitely feed off it. Like Davion Mitchell said after the game that that it's huge when when you're playing in the back end of a back-to-back and you're feeling physically tired. There's a certain boost you can get from a crowd when it responds the way it did last night. And so I think that was really important. The bench I thought was big because, during that 7-game winning streak in November, you remember like it felt like a different guy off the bench was contributing every night. And during this recent downturn, that hadn't really been there. It hadn't been the random, Terrence Davis 30-point game, or the Trey Lyles game where he makes 5 of 8 from 3, or Malik Monk pouring in 30. Like, they got that from Malik Monk last night, and Trey Lyles made a few key plays, and they were plus 13 with Trey Lyles on the floor last night. And, so I think that's a big part of it too. Like, Domantas Sabonis and De'Aaron Fox can really only carry this team so far. Like, they need those contributions, particularly off the bench. And I thought they got them in the form of Malik Monk scoring, Davion Mitchell's defense, particularly against Bones Highland. Like, let's remember, like, Denver was missing a bunch of their core guys, and Bones Highland was having to handle the ball in key situations where normally that would be Jamal Murray. But still, like, the Kings are, nobody feels bad for you in the NBA when you're resting guys, right? But the Kings needed that win in the worst way, and hopefully for their sake, they rediscovered that that energy that it's going to take to play with that defensive intensity, and those guys off the bench can spur them, because we've seen that getting 30 and 15 from Domas and getting 25 and 10 from Fox isn't always going to win them games. They need all those ancillary guys around the margins to play well, given how competitive the West is. Like, they just can't rely on 2 guys every night.
I know you talked to a lot of different guys last night, from Jordy to Malik to De'Aaron. What was the consensus on Domantas Sabonis's game, and just the fact that Sabonis was even out there?
Yeah, it kind of encapsulates what Sabonis means to this team, just even in a broader sense, from like a season-wide perspective. Because I've talked to him before, long before the injury, about the load management stuff, and he's just like vehemently against sitting when he's healthy. Like, if it were up to him, he would play in every single game, even if there were if every night was a back-to-back. Like, Domas is just that type of guy. I think a lot of that probably comes from his dad. And just, that sort of old school mentality, but he just wants to be out there. And I think for the Kings to have a guy like their best player, one of their 2 best players, be a guy who plays as hard as he does, who is so committed to remaining available, I think that just sets the tone for the team, and guys do feed off of that. And Malik Monk said it, like, they looked at Domas playing through as much pain as he was playing through as the reason they won the game. And so when your best player is also like your hardest playing player, I think that can be really big for a team. And I think that's what Domas is for the Kings. Like, as much as people, myself included, like, I don't think Domas is, the best defensive center in the league, and he might not be the anchor that you're going to have if you're going to have a top 5 defense in the NBA and whatnot. But his value to the Kings, even beyond what he does offensively, I think is just the tone setting that the way he sets the tone by the intensity he brings every night, and the consistency that he brings, and just how hard he plays. Because he might not be the best defensive center in the league, but he's damn sure one of the best defensive rebounders in the league. And that's been really important for the Kings when they do play good defense, is they're rebounding the ball defensively at a high rate. They've typically been among the best defensive rebounding teams in the NBA this season. And obviously Sabonis, as one of the leading rebounders in the league, has a huge part of that. So it's just him playing last night and him willing to tough out this injury just speaks to his overall value to the team, in my opinion, beyond like what he does from a numbers perspective.
Sabonis is a great communicator on the defensive end as well. He's always talking, and that's something that, as long as we've been doing this show, I've been praying for somebody to communicate more on the defensive end. He does that and wonderfully out there. One of the things, and I'm still working on this analogy. Tell me if it's off, or you kind of catch my vibe, or whatever the case may be. But Damien, I think you talked about Domantas being the unquestioned leader of this team when we're talking about getting the show ready. And you can go back and forth or whatever and say who's the best player, Fox, Sabonis, whatever the case may be. They both can lay claim to that. They both have their own arguments. But it kind of reminded me a little bit of the early 2000 Kings and C-Webb and Vlade. Now, Sabonis is a much better player than Vlade Divac, but C-Webb was the best player. The heart and soul, the leader of that team was Vlade Divac. And that's kind of what I feel with Domantas Sabonis. Like I said, he's a better player than Vlade Divac, but he's the rock. He's the guy. He's almost the high school high guy at this point, where they look back and they see what Sabonis is doing, and if he's doing it, then we're gonna do it. That's kind of how I look. You see where I'm coming from with that? Like I say, he's better than Vladdy. He might be the best player on the team, but I think he's the leader of this group.
Yeah, I would agree with that as somebody who's been around the team for most of the, or if not all the season. But like, De'Aaron's the guy who can get to any point on the floor he wants. De'Aaron's the guy who can score in the biggest variety of ways. But to your point, like in terms of the pace setter of the team, the emotional and spiritual leader, I definitely think that's Sabonis. And that's why I think it was so important for them to get him back last night, because again, like he is pretty limited defensively in terms of what he can be. And you're, like I said, you're probably not going to have a top 5 defense if he's your defensive anchor or your best defensive player with your starting lineup. But like he is the heartbeat of the team. He's the guy that other guys feed off of. He's setting really good screens. He's throwing really good passes. He's doing what he can to make sure other guys can get buckets offensively, and while also being the guy who's cleaning up rebounds and scoring at a pretty high clip in his own right. So I think you're right on. Like, I think, in terms of being the most talented player, that's Fox, right? The most talented basketball player on the team, I think, is quite clearly De'Aaron Fox. But the emotional and spiritual leader, in my opinion, is Domantas Sabonis.
Who's also really, really freaking good.
He is. He's very talented, extremely talented. Yeah. I'm not trying to take anything away from him, but I think Fox is probably the more talented player, but Domas is just like spiritually that guy.
And in the same regard, when I mentioned to Kenny that I thought De'Aaron Fox, or that I thought Domantas Sabonis was the leader of this team, we talked after Tuesday's game about the pace of the game and how frustrating it was, and how it felt like you should push because the hopes of wearing Nikola Jokic down might be your only hope to slow him down. And we all acknowledged that was lacking on Tuesday. Was it lacking last night?
No, they played Kings basketball.
And when you see it, like you see Domas, we talked about this on Friday. You could see Domas even in those final minutes of Friday's game versus the Wizards. Let's go. Push. Like you see him regularly making the motions. Move, push. And to me, that's everything people wanted from De'Aaron that he's not, and that's okay. Domas is.
Yeah, I agree with that. And to your point, I think the Kings want to play fast. Like they want to be one of the fastest playing teams in the league. And one of the things, this is kind of a tangent, but one of the things I've been thinking about a little bit, like we've seen how much they've struggled to find a backup option behind Domas at center. We saw them go small a little bit on Tuesday with Trey Lyles at the 5. I'm very curious what a lineup with Harrison Barnes, Keegan Murray, Malik Monk, Kevin Huerter, and De'Aaron Fox would look like if they don't have Sabonis on the floor. Can they play with that pace despite whoever the other team's center is, and force matchup issues by playing fast? Pass the ball at a high rate and exploit the fact that they could be a whole lot faster than everybody else. I thought, if Sabonis had missed an extended period of time, that would have offered the Kings unique opportunity to try that route. But I wonder if they're going to do that at certain points now, because I think playing fast is something that they need to do regardless of if Sabonis is on the floor, because it's a huge advantage for them when Sabonis can grab a rebound, sprint up court, and teams don't have time to match up in transition. And I wonder if that's something they can do when he's not out there, just by virtue of playing really fast. And so I wonder if that gave them, Tuesday's game gave them a little bit of insight. Like, okay, if we don't have Sabonis and our half court offense isn't going to be quite the same without that hub who can set screens and set passes, like, can they make up for that with just pure speed? And I wonder if that's something that we see from them going forward when Sabonis isn't on the floor.
You're listening to D'Lo and KC on KIFM West Sacramento 98.5 FM, KRXQ, HD2 Sacramento, ESPN 1320, driven by Lasher's Elk Grove Dodge, always live on the free Odyssey app. As we transition to what was once thought to be one of the biggest regular season games for each particular franchise, but as the season has rolled along,
ready to break up my happy home to go to Las Vegas for that.
Well, it was a good thing you didn't, because you wouldn't have gotten there.
Right.
Unless you were driving, you wouldn't have made it. It's the San Francisco 49ers and the Las Vegas Raiders this weekend in Las Vegas. Chris, let's start with this, and there's obviously a million storylines here, but let's start with Deebo Samuel at practice today. He's not playing, is he?
No, the 49ers, I mean, I don't think so. He might, but the 49ers have typically, with guys coming back from injuries, had guys return to practice late in the week leading up to a game and then had them play the next week. So I would be very surprised if they played Deebo Samuel Sunday in Las Vegas, but I would be less surprised if he suited up for the season finale against Arizona, because they kind of like to ramp guys up ahead of time. So, he has maybe 5 practices under his belt before playing against the Cardinals rather than just 2 before playing against Vegas coming off that injury. That's how they've typically operated. Again, each injury is sort of a case-by-case basis, I guess, but I would be pretty surprised if Deebo Samuel comes back, because we know they want the 2 seed. The 2 seed's critically important to them, but I have to think Kyle Shanahan believes that with the offensive pieces they have without Deebo, they can still beat the Raiders, who are going to be playing, Jarrett Stidham at quarterback.
Yeah, Stidham, either one. I don't know. I don't know which one it is. But either way, it's going to be a tall task.
Yeah, it's Jarrett Stidham against that defense. I'm sure Jarrett Stidham, I'm sure he could be a fine quarterback. I'm sorry, you're throwing him out there against that defense. That's tough.
The
tough.
Patriots,
but it's in line with Josh McDaniels' coaching decisions.
The Patriots, when they got Jarrett Stidham, they moved heaven and earth to make sure that Jarrett Stidham was not their quarterback, right? which is kind of the wild thing, right? Like, Jarrett Stidham was first on the depth chart, and then they got Cam Newton right before training camp in 2020. Then they move on from Cam, they go draft Mac Jones. Brian Hoyer becomes a preferred option at backup quarterback. And then they draft another 4th-round quarterback in Bailey Zappi and trade Stidham for, they trade Stidham and a 7th-round pick for a 6th-round pick. Not exactly a ringing endorsement for his value. And now all of a sudden the Raiders are starting this guy before they're even mathematically eliminated from the playoffs. It's such a weird situation to me. And, it kind of feels like they're just punting on this situation, and they're very clearly in the mind that they want to move on from Derek Carr and avoid paying him that guaranteed money that becomes that hits the books if he's on the roster 3 days after the Super Bowl. But I mean, that the wildest part to me is that they're making this move before they're mathematically eliminated. Like, there's a scenario where the Raiders sneak into the playoffs, but apparently they're either not interested in doing that or believe Jarrett Stidham gives them a better shot. And regardless of how Derek Carr has played recently, I just don't buy it. Like, I don't, Josh McDaniels spent all that time in New England, was there when they were doing all they could to avoid having to play Jarrett Stidham. And now all of a sudden he's their best option again in the postseason. I just don't see it.
Yeah, that's crazy. Back to the 49ers. We talk about Deebo coming back, at some point, he's practicing and all this other stuff. One thing that I didn't see coming, and I kind of dismissed and forgot about, and we talk about guys returning, is Elijah Mitchell. They're talking about his window to come back may be near. Chris, do you think we see him before the regular season is over? And talk about the impact of him coming back and teaming up with Christian McCaffrey.
Be an electrifying one game that he returns and gets hurt again.
So
bringing him back, when he came back the first time this year, he looked electric and explosive.
Yeah.
And putting him with Christian McCaffrey is crazy. So, like, when do you think we'll see him?
I think there's a chance he plays before the regular season ends. Certainly the Cardinals game would make more sense than Sunday in Vegas. I think Kyle Shanahan, one thing I was interested to find out after the Washington game over the weekend, and I asked around a little bit, was like, how are they approaching these last few games with the understanding that they want the 2 seed versus, trying to balance out keeping guys healthy for the playoffs. And Kyle Shanahan, his viewpoint on this is like, you got to keep your foot on the gas, because, and I agree with them to a certain extent. Like, you don't want to back into the playoffs when, not playing your best football leading into it. You want to make sure you're playing at a high level. And I think Kyle Shanahan in general, we've typically seen his 49ers teams play their best football in November and December, particularly when they were playoff teams. They were certainly a lot better in December than they were like in September and October, right? So He's very much of the mind, like, we want to go in with as much momentum as possible, which is why you might see Deebo Samuel get worked in at some point before the regular season ends. And same with Elijah Mitchell. What Mitchell gives the 49ers, I think, is the opportunity to utilize other guys the way that they're sort of optimized to be used, right? Like Deebo Samuel, as good of running back replacement as he can be, like, I don't think he's being maximized when you're just asking him to run between the tackles like they did last year, because they didn't have running backs that they really trusted in that spot. Like that, Deebo Samuel played running back last year a lot because it was a necessity. When you have Christian McCaffrey, that alleviates some of it. And when you have Elijah Mitchell, that allows you to utilize Christian McCaffrey more as a pass catcher too, which is, I think, really where he's most valuable, is like a check down option, a screen guy, a guy who can, move the chains on third down, running routes from the slot. So when you have Elijah Mitchell, it sort of allows you to utilize all the other guys in the way that you would ideally utilize them. So with Mitchell back, you don't have to run Deebo Samuel between the tackles a handful of times, right? You can give him those carries. And, Jordan Mason, I think, has been a nice story and a promising player, but I think in the second half of a playoff game, you'd probably rather have Elijah Mitchell because he's just better than Jordan Mason at this point. And that's not to take anything away from Mason, but, Elijah Mitchell closing those games as a runner, I think was pretty effective when he did come back from the injury after they acquired McCaffrey, right? So I think that's sort of the idealized version of what this offense could look like, is having Elijah Mitchell back in the fold, being able to use Samuel more as a receiver and more as sort of a unique chess piece rather than having him be a running back. And the same for McCaffrey. Like, you can utilize him more as a pass catcher. You don't have to give him 20 carries like you got in Seattle. And overall, you can just keep everybody a little bit fresher and keep fewer hits off their bodies.
The holidays and kind of the nature of the schedule and our schedule. I thought that game against the Durs, if you will, the Washington, I thought that was a sneaky, really impressive win.
I thought so too.
Like, that football team is fighting for their life, like they're fighting for their playoff existence. And the 49ers just came in there and took care of business like that. It didn't get the coverage because of the variety of things that happened, over the holiday weekend. That was a really good win by San Francisco, in my opinion.
They put 37 points on them while having 3 drives that ended in sort of like disappointing fashion with field goals, right? Like that easily could have been a 45 point performance had they, had they been a little bit better in the red zone. But yeah, like the fact that,
but not to mention a pick and failing on 4th and 1 in your own territory.
Right. So the fact that, you can get George Kittle going, and now teams have to respect George Kittle. You're doing this without Deebo Samuel, right? You get a big play from Brandon Ayuk, a big 54-yard play. You get a 70-yard touchdown from Ray McLeod. Like, when people talk about the 49ers, the first names that they mention are Christian McCaffrey and Deebo Samuel. Well, they hung 37 points on a really good defense playing for its playoff life without those guys really contributing. And so to get George Kittle back as sort of, George Kittle's one of the best tight ends in the league, but in terms of the way the 49ers use him, he's almost like a secondary piece. Like a lot of these touchdowns, maybe with the exception, the last couple games against Seattle and Washington, a lot of these touchdowns have been like Kittle's like a 4th read, right? But he was a primary read where they faked it one way and faked it the other and then had the touchdown down the middle in Seattle. But the other touchdown, he was a 4th read. He stole a touchdown from Ray McLeod on the first one that he scored against Washington. Like, to have George Kittle as like a secondary option in the passing game is kind of wild to think about, right? And so when you're playing a 7th round quarterback who's a rookie, and you have an option like George Kittle, who is your 3rd or 4th read, or, Brandon Ayuk, who would be the number 1 receiver on a lot of teams as a 2nd or 3rd read, Christian McCaffrey is your check down option. Like, the 49ers are sitting in a really good spot, particularly given that they're trying to ingratiate a young rookie quarterback. So that to me is what keeps standing out about just this run with Brock Purdy, is that Kyle Shanahan is sort of, he's found a quarterback who can run the offense exactly the way he wants it run. And I think when we think about Kyle Shanahan's sort of infatuation with Kirk Cousins, that's how Shanahan views Kirk Cousins, as somebody who can run the offense. and distribute it to the right spot because Shanahan has confidence in his ability to get guys open. That's sort of what we're seeing with Purdy now. It's like the manifestation of that. And it's just so fascinating because it's a polar opposite of Trey Lance. Like Kyle Shanahan was trying to get Trey Lance to be that type of quarterback while hoping that, his immense physical tools can elevate him beyond the structure of the offense. Now we're just seeing Kyle Shanahan having a mind meld with a quarterback who can run his offense really well. And given all the weapons the 49ers have, it seems to be working out.
Chris, you're one of the best in the business, man. We appreciate you so much, and thank you for everything that you've done for D'Lo and Casey here in 2022, and your ability to jump in and cover the Kings and talk about them as in-depthly as you talk about the San Francisco 49ers, who you've been covering for years, is truly phenomenal, man. We appreciate you so much, and look forward to 2023, and Happy New Year.
Man, I appreciate you guys. It's nice of you to say. I hope you guys all have a great New Year, had great holidays, and have enjoyed times with your family, and keep continuing to do so.